I'm Eric Sapp. I'm a staff attorney at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. I do a range of legal support, including technical assistance, legislative advocacy, litigation, and trainings like this. And if anyone in the audience is a part of a QLSP, feel free to reach out and for information about the legal support that LSPC does. And I'm joined by Daniella Dane.
Hi, like Eric said, my name is Daniella Dane, and I'm a policy fellow here at Legal Services for Prisoners of Children. So I'll be starting off the presentation. So I guess let's dive in. So voting while unhoused, legal rights, barriers, and advocacy for people who need to vote. So first, we're going to talk about the criminalization of homelessness because this plays a big part in actually prohibiting unhoused people from voting. So the criminalization of homelessness refers to different laws, policies, different practices that punish people who are unhoused. Specifically for just trying to survive, outside, because it's hard for them to, survive with the cost of living and everything. So this includes, sleeping in public places, sleeping in parks, bus stops. So usually instead of addressing the root causes of homelessness, such as unaffordable housing, lack of housing, minimum wage. Sometimes the governments use police and courts to remove unhoused people from view. So like when the city does street sweeps and has people give people tickets for parking their RVs to support their families in public places. That's essentially treating poverty as a public nuisance instead of looking at it as a human right. And so we need to remember that the criminalization of homelessness, it's not a policy failure. It's an intentional system that works to make sure that people don't have housing. So we need to make sure that we don't penalize people who are unhoused for trying to basically survive. And we need to make sure that people who are unhoused don't have specific they need access to health care, employment, and social support. So we're gonna move on to how the criminalization of homelessness has deep historical roots. So disenfranchisement of marginalized communities, especially Black, Indigenous, disabled, and poor people have been built in the into the U.S. law and policy for generations, from Jim Crow laws, felony disenfranchisement to redlining and the defunding of public housing. These structures have long been used to deny access to both political power and economic stability. Today's mass incarceration, policing of poverty, and housing discrimination maintain that legacy and perpetuate it today. Even when unhoused people are legally allowed to vote, they face major barriers like the lack of ID, misinformation, and systematic surveillance that effectively silence their stories. What we see now is not accidental. It is the modern version of a long-standing patterns of using criminalization and exclusion to control marginalized populations and suppress their rights. The jailing of unhoused people. So this analysis was performed by the Prison Policy Initiative, and it covers booking in jails nationwide from the year 2023 to 2024. So they examined data from the Jail Data Initiative, which covered around 900 jails within the US. Researchers examined how the legal system handles people identified as unhoused at the time of booking. So this represents the most current and extensive picture of how local jails are used to manage homelessness. So in 1 year period, from July 2023 to June 2024, there were a total of 22,839 bookings, where people were identified as being unhoused individuals. This represents 4.5% of the total bookings from those jails, 503,000, 571 total bookings. But unhoused people, they only make up 0.2% of the US population. So over 205,000 people are unhoused people who are jailed every year. And roughly 1/3 of the national unhoused population on any given night. And 42% of unhoused individuals were booked multiple times in 1 year, whereas only about 20% of housed individuals or unknown housing status individuals experienced repeat bookings. So people who are experiencing homelessness, they're more likely to be rearrested multiple times a year. So this points to a cycle of jail churn that deepens the instability for people who are already facing a crisis and mental health and who are already in poverty. So the average jail stay for people who are unhoused is 32 days, while the overall average jail stay is only 21 days. The median stay for unhoused people, so the average stay is 14 days versus just 4 days overall. And reasons can include lack of bail for many, no stable address or family context, and also just difficulty navigating release conditions. So, and people who are unhoused, they mostly commit low-level offenses. So they're typically arrested and jailed for trespassing, petty theft, shoplifting, small amounts of drug possession, and public order violations like public intoxications. Very few of the arrests and bookings of unhoused people are violent crimes, and usually their crimes are tied to their survival, such as poverty. And who's mostly impacted? Black people make up about 40% of unhoused bookings, while they represent only 31% of overall jail bookings. People who are 55 and older make up about 15% of unhoused bookings, higher than their share among people who are housed. These disparities reflect broader racial and economic injustices, with older Black and disabled people facing higher criminalization. Only 20% of jails in the data reported unhoused status at intake. Many jails, they don't consistently track housing status, so the number of people who are unhoused could even be greater than the statistics I just mentioned. Some unhoused individuals don't share that they are unhoused either. So that 205,000 is likely an undercount of the number of people who are experiencing jail. And so we're going to look at the Alameda County and San Francisco County, the homelessness rate in the area, just to get a better understanding of what the current conditions in the Bay Area look like for people who are unhoused. And this is the point in time count from 2024. So the point in time census count for those who are unhoused, counties all over the United States who receive housing from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development are mandated to do this count every year. So for all counties who participate in the point in time count, it's important to know that because the census count is only conducted one night out of the year. This might not be an accurate representation of the total amount of people who experience homelessness over the entire year. The county consists of people who are staying in emergency shelters, transitional housing, or who are unsheltered, like, spending the night outdoors or in their cars, parks, or abandoned buildings. So the shelter counts include people and families who resided in public and private shelters, such as emergency shelters, domestic violence shelters, and transitional housing. The general street count consisted of individuals and families who were surveyed between the hours of 8 p.m. until midnight. The street count consisted of individuals who were sleeping outdoors and on the street, such as train stations, buses, park, tents, abandoned properties, and vehicles. So the point in time homeless count for San Francisco, as of last year, the total homeless population was 8,323. Out of those people, 3,994, so 48% of those people, they were able to stay in a shelter, some type of transitional housing, whereas 4,329, 52% of unhoused people were sleeping in an abandoned building, street, park, or car. 59% of people who were unhoused are men, 32% are women, and 9% identified as another gender. They didn't specify. So about 33% of people who are unsheltered stayed in their cars, RVs, or vans, while 67% lived on streets or in tents. And the rest of the unhoused people didn't have a specific location where they specified where they were staying. So in San Francisco, some of the top causes of homelessness included 22% experienced job loss or reduced income. 19% had issues related to drug or alcohol abuse. 14% of those were evicted. 11% left their home due to unsafe or unstable living conditions with their family or friends. 9% had a divorce or breakup, and for that reason they had to leave their place of living. 7% of people experienced some sort of mental illness, which contributed to their being unhoused. And then 7% of people who ended up being unhoused were recently involved in the criminal justice system, so recently arrested or released from prison. And then, so the homeless count in Alameda County, the total homeless population, 9,450, so a little bit higher than San Francisco County. The amount of people who were able to be housed in a shelter were 3,107, so only 33%, while people who were unsheltered made up 67% of the population. So that's actually a 3.2% decrease since 2021. 2022, and 66.6% of the unhoused people in Alameda County were men, and 30.7% were women, and then about 2.7 people identified as being gender neutral or didn't specify. And 54% of the people who were unsheltered in Alameda County had to reside to living in their cars, vans, or RVs, while 17% lived on the street or sidewalk, and 21% lived in tents or self-made shelters. And in Alameda County, some of the top causes of homelessness were 35% were evicted or lost housing, 22% experienced job loss or reduced income, 18.1% had health related issues or chronic illness, 18% experienced household breakup or family loss. 35% reported serious mental illness, so that's a pretty big number. 29% had a substance abuse disorder. About 40% reported having at least one disabling condition, and another 30% experienced domestic violence or some type of familial trauma. And so all of us are none LSPC. In 2020, we helped pass Prop 17, which restores the right for people on parole who have completed their prison sentences to be able to vote. Before Prop 17, individuals on parole were permanently disenfranchised until their parole ended. This disproportionately affected families and communities affected by mass incarceration. By allowing people on parole to vote, Prop 17 helps reduce the cycle of disenfranchisement that often extends beyond the individual to their family members, promoting greater civic participation and addressing systematic inequalities rooted in racial and economic injustice. This is an important step forward, reuniting families and communities through restoring voting rights and political voice for people. So under California law, you can register to vote if you are in a county jail serving a misdemeanor sentence or serving a felony sentence inside a county jail. For example, not in under realignment, not in a state prison or waiting trial, or serving jail time as part of a felony or misdemeanor probation. On probation, parole, post-release supervision, or similar supervision statuses, you can register and vote. The only time you're ineligible to vote is if you're in a state or federal prison for a felony conviction or in county jail awaiting a transfer to a state or federal prison under felony sentencing. And I believe I'm gonna pass it off to, oh, sorry, let me just finish this up. So you can register to vote as long as you know you're you're a US citizen, but you do not need a California ID or driver's license. You don't need a permanent home address either. So so in order to register to vote, if you are unhoused, all you need is the intersection of a place that you might be staying near. And you can always ask a friend or family member if they're comfortable with you using their address as well. To register, you just need your name, date of birth, the last four of your SSN. And if you're going to register not on the same day registration or online, you need a mailing address. So this can be a shelter, a friend or a family member. However, if you do same day voter registration, you do not need a mailing address. And if your signature can't be verified, you can vote provisionally, and you can later what is called cure your signature to make sure that your signature was verified. And if that's the case, you'll be contacted by your county elections office by mail if you listed a mailing address, or by text or phone or email if you provided them that information. If you did not provide that information, you can always check your ballot status after voting, especially if you voted provisionally. Okay, and I'm going to pass it off to Eric now.
Thanks, Danielle. And we'll return briefly toward the end of my remarks to provisional voting and conditional registration as well. And just a reminder, folks can write questions in the Q&A function, and Uma will read those out when we get to the Q&A period. And also, we will save time for people to raise their virtual hand and ask their questions live if they prefer. And just a reminder, if you're seeking CLE credit, follow the link and instructions in the chat for that. So I'm going to share screen, and in just a moment, and all the slides will be available online. Okay, hopefully folks can see my screen here. So first, step back into the ancient world of 2.5 millennia ago and the concept of democracy. So democracy, which was originally not used by its proponents, but was used by its detractors, but nevertheless has come to have a positive valence, and something that I think it's fair to say most people affirm as a political philosophy. Democracy comes from demos, which for our purposes we can think of as the people in general, universally without exception. And the crassy part, kratos, means strength or power. So the power of the people could be a literal calque translation of democracy. Now, according to the contemporary French philosopher Jacques Rancière, the demos is a rupture in the logic of rule, or command and domination by those who claim the legitimacy of rule based on birth, wealth, strength, or claims to virtue or knowledge. That is, the demos is qualified for rule without any status hierarchy. Now, the people, as Rancière puts it, is a supplement that inscribes the count of the unaccounted for, or the part of those who have no part. That is to say, in a undemocratic or hierarchical system, where it's thought that the poor or common people do not count, that their voices have no part in the decision-making of a society, that conception is rejected by the philosophy of democracy, whereby the people is able to assert itself for rule. Now, interestingly, in its original conception, again, 2,500 years ago or so, in ancient Greece, the classic form of democracy was had its assembly selected by lottery. That is to say, there was no electoral campaigning or voting, rather a purely random selection of representatives was the method whereby the legislature was composed, as it were, or the main decision-making body for important decisions of the community. I would argue that a lottery system is more democratic than an electoral system, in that it assures an absence of bias, and in particular the bias generated by wealth and other forms of power that enable electoral systems in the modern world to be manipulated and sometimes be undemocratic. But we are in the mass society and its technological complexity. We are far afield from the ancient world, in some ways for the better, in some ways perhaps not. One more philosophical point of reference, the German philosopher Hegel of the early 19th century, in his work, The Philosophy of Right, talked about a particular problem of what we could call electoral apathy. He called it indifference. And this has since been studied by political scientists in the 20th century under the name Downs paradox. But it was first articulated by Hegel, and in Knox's translation, which I'm going to read, he describes it as follows. As for popular suffrage, that is to say, universal eligibility to vote, It may be further remarked that, especially in large states, it leads inevitably to electoral indifference, since the casting of a single vote is of no significance where there is a multitude of electors. Even if a voting qualification is highly valued or esteemed by those who are entitled to it, they still do not enter the polling booth. Thus, the result of an institution of this kind is more likely to be the opposite of what was intended. Election actually falls into the power of a few, of a caucus, and so the particular and contingent interests, which is precisely what was to have been neutralized. That is to say, in Hegel's analysis, there's what could be called a Sorites paradox, where the massing together of a multitude of votes makes it appear that any single vote is insignificant, sort of like a grain of sand in a giant beach. And then so someone may come to the view that their vote doesn't matter, whereas the inconvenience of voting seems very salient, and so people think that it doesn't matter to vote. Now, this problem, as articulated here, was stated generally and without regard to the social situation of the would-be voter. However, we could say that in the case of persons who are unhoused or persons who are insecurely housed, it has a special resonance, because the likelihood of feeling disaffected with the political system is apt to be rather acute if someone is in a situation where society has not benefited them very much, and the seeming pointlessness of voting could easily come to the fore. And so there's a certain this is a problem to be overcome, and I'm not offering any solution to it other than to the extent that we can facilitate voting and so reduce the cost side of that calculus, the possibility of participation, should someone decide to exercise it, is at least marginally improved. We live in a society in which, although there is a right to vote while unhoused, there is no right to housing in the United States. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which the United States is a signatory to in 1948, although it is not or is generally regarded not as a legally binding instrument, but rather a declaration of principles, of ideas, recognize the right to housing in Article 25, Section 1. In fact, it recognized the right to a standard of living advocating a standard of living adequate for well-being, which included, among other things, housing. And Article 21 of the UN Declaration made recognized as a human right universal and equal suffrage, that is the right to vote without discrimination. And it recognizes that to be either through representatives or directly. Now, what is a legally binding instrument in international law is the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights, which the U.S. signed in 1977, waited a decade and a half to ratify, but is a full member of that treaty. What the Convention on Civil and Political Rights did in the relevant part was legalize the voting, political voting and representation aspects of the Declaration of Human Rights, as you see here, is in Article 25 of the ICCPR. However, it omitted the housing aspect. So there is no right to housing in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, although that is treated in a companion treaty which the United States did not join, which is the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Non-discrimination for voting is invoked in Article 25, and it refers to Article 2 in its non-discrimination clause, which includes property and other status. as a basis on which distinction is prohibited. So what that means is that to have a voting rights that discriminated based on property and other status, which arguably includes housing status, would be contrary to international law. Closer to home, California Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. Daniella eloquently described Proposition 17 earlier. Just to review that, Article 2, Section 2, in the form in which it was amended by Prop 17, says that disqualification from voting can only happen while someone is in prison. Article 2, Section 4 specifically says that someone serving a state or federal prison term for the conviction of a felony is disqualified from voting in California. However, what that specifically means is that if someone is in jail, including in jail for a felony, if they receive a jail sentence for that felony or for a misdemeanor, then they are still eligible if they're otherwise eligible in California. Before I dig into the election code, I just want to put forth some practical takeaways, which is that what I'm calling best practices, if someone is incarcerated, that is to say, like in jail in California, they should use a prior residence for the purposes of eligibility, but use the jail for the mailing address so that they receive relevant election materials. For someone who's unhoused and not incarcerated, they can use a habitual dwelling place to list as a residence for qualification purposes, which could be a street corner, some other identifiable location, or shelter if they go there frequently, or they can use it, and that's what they should use for residence purposes. That is for the eligibility, and then for receiving mail related to election materials, they should, and including notification about any issues that arose with the casting of their ballot or their registration eligibility. The mailing address could be a reliable community organization such as a shelter or church, or using the post office's general delivery or PO box system, which can in many cases be free of charge for those who are unhoused. Lost share screen for a moment. Okay, so Election Code 2101 basically inscribes the constitutional requirements, the state constitutional requirements, and as it's described here in subdivision A, if someone is not imprisoned for the conviction of a felony, they are otherwise eligible to vote, and they're otherwise eligible to vote. They can't have their vote taken away. And as a result of AB 646, it was clarified that imprisoned means serving a state or federal prison term. Because prior to that piece of legislation, there was some debate about whether someone who was, for example, in jail on realignment sentencing, whether they were eligible, and it was determined that they were. Under the election code, counties are under the obligation to provide a sufficient number of registration places throughout the county, including by the courthouse, for the convenience of people desiring to register, to the end that registration may be maintained at a high level. And so, for example, someone who's unhoused could take advantage of the statutory requirement to register at the county courthouse if they aren't able to receive mail in a logistically feasible manner, and of course at the elections offices and other remote registration locations that the county is required to do under state law. And counties vary in their eagerness to implement those, but some counties are quite concerned about making sure that they do outreach. 2102 makes it clear that registration is by affidavit. That means you are affirming under penalty of perjury that you qualify, that you meet the requirements, for example, age and residence. And the significance of that is that you don't need an ID to prove, at least unless there's some controversy on the basis of evidence that calls into question someone's affidavit. Failing something like that, the mere fact of affirming where you reside is sufficient to qualify you for registering. And again, 2102 subdivision C specifies that the content of the affidavit shall be certified as to its truthfulness and correctness under penalty of perjury by the signature of the affiant. That same code section has rights related to accommodations for persons with disability in subdivision E as well as subdivision F. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about case law, although one case I just want to mention is Carrington versus Rash from 1965. That had to do with state to state eligibility, but it established the principle that one has a right to vote where they live. In that case, someone was crossing state lines between where they worked and where they resided, and the court said that they couldn't be prevented from voting where they live. Back to the California Election Code, 21, section 2021. These are code sections, not years, just in case anyone's confused. Section 2021 basically says that if you relocate temporarily without the with the intention of returning, you don't lose your domicile in that precinct, the first one. Now, for our purposes, domicile means the same as residence. There's no domicile is used in the statutes, but residence is what the California Constitution uses. And election materials tend to use either the term residence or just common terms like where you live. And subdivision B of section 2021 says that temporary without the intention of making that precinct your home doesn't change your domicile. So with this, the implication of this is important for someone who is in jail, because let's say someone lived in Los Angeles but was in jail in San Francisco, and they had no intention of moving to San Francisco after being released. Their domicile or residence would still be Los Angeles. Now, the question of incarceration is especially addressed in section 2025, where it talks about prison, although that also applies to jail. So a person does not gain or lose a domicile solely by reason of his or her presence or absence from a place while employed in the service of the United States, or engaged in navigation, et cetera, or in prison. That is to say, your residence doesn't just become where you are incarcerated. Now, if someone is released and ends up staying in the precinct where the jail is located or somewhere else in that area, and maybe it's a different precinct than the jail, but it's still different from where one resided prior to being incarcerated, then that new place could become their residence. And Election Code 2027 is relevant to that scenario, and specifies that residence in a trailer or vehicle or public camp or camping ground may constitute a domicile for voting purposes if the registrant complies with the other requirements in this article. And more generally, specified in the preceding clause that where someone lives is their residence unless it's temporary. Now, one aspect of voting, which surprisingly a lot of voters don't know about, which is conditional voter registration. And there's a good reason why they don't know about it, is because most election outreach emphasizes the deadlines for registering, and so wants to get everybody registered in advance and not wait for the last moment. And so the emphasis on registration deadlines is part of outreach materials. However, even if one misses the registration deadline, if someone's eligible, they can vote anyway through the conditional voter registration and provisional balloting process, which is outlined in Section 2170 of the Election Code. And basically, if you're within 14 days of an election, you can conditionally register and cast a provisional ballot. And those can be challenged later and may require verification. And Daniella, in one of her slides in her talk, in her segment of the talk, mentioned some of the processes that counties use for verification purposes. But for the most part, what's important to know is that it is possible to vote even after registration has happened. And that includes, that's not limited to same-day voting, but it includes same-day voting. So that means that on election day, you can both register and cast a vote, and that will be counted, assuming you are eligible and nothing goes wrong with the verification process. That's especially important for someone who doesn't have a lot of time to deal with the bureaucracy of it, and also, if someone is encountering logistical problems with receiving mail. Provisional voting on same-day registration is a pretty good option. And Section 2170 expressly references Section 14.310 and 14.310 through 14.314 of the Election Code goes into the details of provisional voting. That is a topic for another presentation. We're not going to get too much into the weeds of that. And before I turn it over to Daniella for additional thoughts, I'm going to just make a quick argument for further reflection. So in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution post-Civil War, it said that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. It was argued in the early 70s that disenfranchisement of persons with felony convictions was an equal protection violation. Under California law at that time, which was pre-Prop 17, someone could be disenfranchised even after being paroled. And that made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Richardson versus Ramirez, which we treated in depth in another program last year. And there the court said that equal protection did not prevent California from disenfranchising persons in that situation. Now, again, that's no longer the law in California due to Prop 17, but nevertheless, it is a constitutional law that equal protection doesn't prevent disenfranchisement for criminal convictions. Now, you can argue that, however, that in a state like California that currently has legalized involuntary servitude, that Amendment 15 prevents disenfranchisement. And that argument would go something like this. Section 1 of the 15th Amendment, which went into effect in 1870, says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of previous condition of servitude. Now, that applied to persons who were enslaved prior to the Civil War, and but arguably today, persons who are in a state where involuntary servitude is mandated are in a condition of servitude, and so even if ineligible to vote while in prison, upon release, they would literally be someone who had previously been in a condition of servitude, and therefore, under the 15th Amendment, that the disenfranchisement of persons in that scenario should be unconstitutional. Again, that's not particularly relevant for California, but it could be relevant for other states that have involuntary servitude if they don't also have the restoration of voting rights upon release. And just to give you the references to the constitutional argument, for the constitutional argument, Article 1, Section 6 has to do with voluntary servitude, and Penal Code 2701 requires work for those incarcerated in prison. So I will turn it back over to Daniella, and then we'll have Q&A.
Okay, we're gonna close out with why voting matters, especially for people who are unhoused, which is yeah, really important to pay attention to, and that's why like Eric mentioned, same-day voter registration is a really good tool that people can utilize to make sure that their vote counts, even if they don't have a physical address. So elected officials make decisions about housing, policing, public health, mental health care, public transit, shelters, and social services. When people who are unhoused vote, they can help elect leaders who actually prioritize these issues, like minimum wage, affordable housing, tenant protections, the decriminalization of homelessness. Without their votes, it's easier to ignore people who are unhoused, leaving others to speak for them without their lived experience. It's a way to counter disenfranchisement. So many people who are unhoused are also formerly incarcerated, disabled, people of color, veterans, or have LGBTQ status, or survivors of the foster care system. These communities have really long histories of being systematically silenced in the United States, which is what I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. Voting becomes a powerful act of resistance against political exclusion. It's a way for people to reclaim our voice and our civic power. It's important that we shape the narrative. So when unhoused people vote, they disrupt harmful stereotypes that they are irresponsible and invisible. Their participation reframes homelessness as a political and structural issue, not as an individual failure on their part. It also helps build alliances with movements for racial justice, disability rights, prison abolition, and economic justice. And it's also data marginalization. So in California, there are about 186,000 people who are unhoused, but only 10% vote. Of course, it's really hard to track people who are unhoused, how much they vote, especially because most states do not collect or analyze data. Formerly incarcerated and unhoused voters are often invisible in democratic participation data. So this also contributes to policy neglect, reinforcing conditions that criminalize homelessness and poverty. And it further leads to legal disenfranchisement and civic confusion. So in some states with felony disenfranchisement laws, it disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities who also face higher rates of homelessness. Many unhoused individuals believe incorrectly that they are not allowed to vote, that they need a physical address, or they'll be criminalized for voting if they are ineligible. And so what needs to change? We need to end the criminalization of homelessness, and it requires a complete shift in our approach. We must stop using jails, courts, and police to manage homelessness, and instead we need to invest in long-term community-based solutions. So this includes permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, access to mental health care, building systems of care in crisis that do not rely on law enforcement. And we need to invest in our people and our communities. We need to make sure that governments allow improved data collection on housing status at the point of jail booking, also to also better understand and address who is being criminalized and why. And most importantly, we must repeal laws that punish people for surviving in public spaces, because no one should be jailed for not having a home. Having a place to live is a human right, and making sure that people who are unhoused vote and that we all vote is a way that we can fight for that right. So I guess we'll close it off. We'll go to questions now.
Yeah, we only have one question in the chat right now, which is there more from the community that stays in jail for longer and repeat charges about why? I've talked to a few and they told me they try to stay because at least they're fed and have a place to sleep.
I didn't find any data on that specifically. But I think that question is really important because it also helps us further our reasoning behind why unhoused people need to vote. It's not a good sign of our society that people would rather be in jail because they don't have a place to stay, stable shelter of living or a way to get food. So yeah, that's really we need to make change. Yeah, affordable housing, it's really a big need, especially in the Bay Area, like Alameda. It's a big need everywhere, but the numbers that I presented on earlier, that data shows how just of a great need that it is. Yeah, so does anybody else have any other comments or any other questions to add? Eric, do you want to add anything?
I'll just add to the last point. It sure is a tragic situation if someone is in the position where they voluntarily uh, would prefer to be in jail than to be unhoused. Now, um, and I'm not denying that that happens anecdotally, certainly, but uh, most people in jail are not there because they want to be. They're there because they can't afford bail, and were given conditions too onerous for them to meet, or they were denied bail, and which of course is a huge topic and is the subject of ongoing litigation as we speak. But yeah, it's a sad symptom of our society if someone is in the position where they can only get shelter and food if through the carceral system, which is obviously not well designed to provide persons' basic needs, psychological needs, and the like, because carceral systems are fundamentally based on violence. They are violent institutions because people are being held through force and often are serving injustice more than they are serving the cause of justice. If folks want to ask questions or and feel free to click on the raise your hand function and you can be unmuted. Also, you can make comments. If you think we got something wrong, feel free to voice that. We don't have a monopoly on the truth here. We value critical conversation. And if anyone also wants to share their experiences or any anecdotal evidence, feel free to share that. And just as a reminder, we'll be making the slides available after the presentation, and if you want to get MCLE credit, indicate that, and also we'll have a evaluation form afterwards, I believe, and you can also email us feedback. Daniella, do you have any additional comments?
No, I don't, but thank you for your work that you did today.
And thanks a lot to Uma for moderating, and thanks a lot for Jocelyn and the LAAC. The LAAC is an invaluable partner in this. We couldn't have done this without them, and I will turn it over for their closing video.